Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Is romantic love coming to an end? You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Recent trends show that the traditional wife is fast becoming a thing of the past. From feminism to technological advances, that role is dimming. But for women of color, their value has always been called into question. Short skin color made many of them the undesirable class. Dr. Sabrina Strings is a professor and North Hall Chair of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she has written a new book entitled The End of Love, Racism, Sexism, and the Death of Romance. She's also authored a previous work, Fearing the Black Body. We have her on the phone this afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start out with where you start, which is where does this concept of romance emerge? It's hundreds of years ago, according to what you've researched.
That's right. Many of us think that romantic relationships are simply natural, that this is how all humans have always wanted to build partnerships, but that's simply not the case. Romance began in medieval Europe, in France in the 12th century, and it began with a tale of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So there was this knight, Lancelot, who was in love with the King Arthur's queen, Guinevere. And once she's captured, Lancelot volunteers to rescue her. And this was the genesis of what we know as romance, because Lancelot needed to be bold and courageous and take risks to prove his love, and Guinevere needed to be beautiful and polite and quiet and elite. And so these are the ideals that we are still living with men being required to pursue quiet, polite, elite, and attractive women.
One of the things I've noticed about that history in general is that this idea of romantic love often meant extramarital affairs as opposed to being, say, married to someone because of, say, economics or family relations. I mean, there did seem to be some kind of separation that seemed to exist during that period leading up to the 20th century.
Absolutely right. So as I was explaining also with the Lancelot tale, the original romantic courtship narratives were all about infidelity. And this went on for hundreds of years. Love, romantic love, was thought to be an escape from marriage, which was all about duty and family responsibility and trying to amass greater landed wealth. No, love was supposed to be this freeing source of excitement that was separate from marriage. It was only in the 19th century when the idea of romance became connected to marriage through a process that's not entirely clear.
I was going to say, because when we enter the industrial age, we talk about this nuclear family as becoming sort of this defining unit. And I know that when we move into the 20th century, you get a lot of books written about romance and marriage, that kind of thing. What changes there? What's happening? Is it just simply that society is reorganizing itself in relationship to technology, to what?
Well, unfortunately, it's a little bit more insidious than that. What I uncovered in my research is that women began the feminist movement in the United States really as an outgrowth of the abolitionist movement. So by the early 20th century, there were a lot of women who were identifying as feminists and suffragettes. And it was the backlash to the ideas of feminism that women might expect to have a place in the public sphere that began the erosion of romance as we know it, because there were powerful elite white men who were writing in men's magazines discouraging other men from pursuing romantic affection with these gross feminists and these rude, mean career women.
So the other key issue here in the United States has been that of race and how black women were viewed, not only by white men, but also by black men. Take me through some of that, particularly in the 19th century when you move from slavery to Jim Crow and then obviously beyond.
One of the things about slavery is that it removed the possibility that black women could be considered romantic partners. So as white men were sort of going on about trying to find affection with white women through romantic courtship often in the U.S., especially after arranged marriages started to decline, black women were able to be used as flesh, as bodies to take advantage of. So in the 19th century, after slavery was abolished, we have something very interesting happening where now, supposedly, black women are eligible for romantic affection, but many of them are not getting it. Instead, what was taking place is that black men, in one of their earliest entrepreneurial activities in America, decided to become pimps. And many of them chose to sell black women back to white men for a profit. And what we find is that this legacy of pimping, not just existing, but also being valorized by many people in the black community, and not just black men, has actually contributed to the difficulty that many black women experience trying to form romantic relationships.
Do we have a sense about why black men did this? I mean, is this simply, at the time, an expression of their, I guess, liberation, as it were, and that they then looked at others, particularly black women, as a way to, say, allow them to be liberated? That is to, I think you use the word, put them down?
Well, Jim Crow is a curious thing, because if we are trying to at least view black men from a perspective of some compassion, we might understand that they didn't have the opportunity to take a job like freely the way many white men would have been able to do. And so because they were now quote unquote free, meaning free from slavery, but also not usually eligible to take the kinds of jobs that were reserved for white men in a Jim Crow economy, many of them were becoming savvy and trying to think through, how do we make money? And so for a lot of them, it was simply the desire to be able to have some type of, I hate to say it, but career, some way of supporting themselves that they could feel proud of. And so this is part of the reason why when people talk about pimping, which, mind you, is a form of sex trafficking, quite commonly, even in hip-hop today, it's valorized. It's looked upon as something that is a way that black men use to get over, that they should not feel any shame about. However, I think we're reaching a point in society in which we can start to rethink that position.
I was going to ask you, just follow on in this train of thought, is that beyond obviously pimping, that is to sell, for instance, black women to white men and so on, what did that do in terms of even just sort of this relationship that was between black women and black men in terms of just simply families? Because as a black man went out into the world, he, as you mentioned a moment ago, he couldn't necessarily get the kind of jobs he would want, or even the kind of respect. Certainly fear was out there as well. I mean, it does seem as if he was emasculated by this white society, and perhaps that he took it out on black women.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. And so it's a difficult situation because there's a way in which the violence was simply displaced onto black women's bodies. So there were black women who wanted to have romantic relationships. And many black women have had romantic relationships. It's not as if it's impossible. It's just that it's not nearly as likely for black women as it is for white women. Because the very idea, when we go back to Lancelot, is that it's supposed to be a knight, a man who's got some status, but, you know, is not wealthy. A knight is supposed to be trying to shoot up, to aim higher, right? So it's a form of social climbing, quite honestly. It might even be a form of gold digging on the part of men that is at the foundation of romance. And so we should not be so surprised then that black women, as a group of people who had been treated like flesh that can simply be used and discarded, once they were eligible for romance and marriage, weren't chosen. Because for many people, and not for nothing, a number of black women and men, black women were seen as beneath the caliber of black men. So, which is to say, there were many black men who looked down on black women, especially dark-skinned black women, as they were choosing women who were lighter skinned, and at the end of Jim Crow, were choosing women who were not black.
Well, you talk about this other idea that seems to creep in, which is the concept you mentioned a moment ago of being a gold digger, that the question is, you know, what does this woman want from this black man, as it were? Tell me a little bit about how that develops in our society.
You know, the irony of the gold digger is that it's one of those terms that black people use quite a bit that actually originated with white people. As far as we can tell, the earliest use of the term gold digger was coming from sort of middle-classish white women who would go out on dates with white men and just accumulate a bunch of wonderful experiences, but have no intention whatsoever of being in a relationship with these men. And they would call themselves gold diggers precisely because, much like the black men who did not have the opportunity to find employment in a white male-dominated economy, neither could white women. And so what they were doing was trying to figure out ways to amass greater wealth and resources for themselves, and using their sexuality was the real main way in which they could do that. Now, after the end of Jim Crow, we start to see more conversation surrounding gold diggers being black women. And there's a complicated history there that cycles through the civil rights movement and then Reagan-era claims about black women being welfare queens. So this whole idea that black women just want to get something for nothing and they don't know how to have marriages and nuclear families, we get this from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. All of this discourse filtered into the understanding of black women as gold diggers. Well, they don't just want to get married. Of course not. No, they want to get something from a man, and especially a black man. Hence the popularity of Kanye West's song, Gold Digger, his most profitable song ever.
I also want to explore this idea about colorism, and I know I've read a lot about the concept of passing. And there are novels written about it. There's been books written about African Americans who may be light enough in skin color to pass, as it were. Famous novel, Passing, I believe there was written in the 1920s, I think it was. Tell me then a little bit how that fits into this attraction, or what's happening here.
Even under slavery, black women who had usually a white father so that they would be, for example, light-skinned or would be today considered biracial, but at the time were considered mulatto or mulatta, these individuals had greater opportunities. And so you hear people often talking about the difference between the house slaves and the field slaves, right? The field slaves were often dark-skinned people. They were frequently men, but also there were a number of dark-skinned women. The lighter-skinned people had favor. They could be in the home. They could be treated better than the darker-skinned slaves. So when slavery was abolished, it's not as if colorism was abolished. No, a lot of colorist ideals circulated within black spaces, and not for nothing still do unto this day. So what we had is that formal legal racial segregation might have been abolished temporarily right after slavery, before Jim Crow cropped up after Reconstruction. But at no point did that undo the psychological conditioning for black people that told them that having fairer skin and also having straighter hair and lighter eyes were preferable because they gave them advantages in a white-dominated society.
So I want to then move towards the civil rights leadership and the civil rights movement, because I remember their phrase, black is beautiful. Women came out, they had afros, for example. And yet you describe the leadership as being having a tenuous relationship necessarily with the concerns of women, particularly Martin Luther King.
Yeah, so this is a history that I don't think a lot of people want to talk about, even though there have been other black feminists who have written about this particular concern, which is that during the civil rights movement, there was a tension because the movement actually began as, there were many different notes, but one of the critical beginnings was that there were black women who were organizing against sexual violence, against the violence of people like Reese Taylor, who was raped by white boys in her community just for kicks. So Rosa Parks got involved in some of these initiatives to end the rape and other forms of assault of black women in the South, and from that grew the, interestingly enough, the Montgomery bus boycotts that we're all so familiar with. So there were years of people working on this question of the sexual assault of black women. But as the movement grew and more men got involved, more black men got involved, the conversation shifted. It became much more about what MLK discussed, about jobs and freedom. Now, that's important, but a lot of these early concerns got lost. And unfortunately, there were a number of misogynists in the movement who would suggest that, well, black women don't even really have a role here. Their role is prone. One of the key organizers, Lee Carmichael, would say things along those lines. So even though we remember the movement fondly, and the movement did make a critical impact in American culture, there's nevertheless the reality that there was a tension between black men and black women because black men expected black women to be subordinate.
The other thing I want to move to is music. And on the one hand, you talk about R&B and this idea that there was a sort of romantic love, and then hip-hop seems to come along and sort of redefine women as merely stage props, as it were. Describe that I had not really thought about it in that fashion, but it was really striking to me.
The interesting thing about black music is that when you look into the history of it, so much of it is about love. Like, think about all of the songs you love from the 60s, 70s, and 80s from black musicians. So much of it is about either romantic love or love of the black community and empowerment. When rap hit the airwaves, it was very much indebted to this legacy of black love and also of civil rights. It was literally an outgrowth of the civil rights movement, and not a lot of people know that about rap. But it was also intended to be a vehicle for many of upward mobility. And if you're trying to think about things that sell in America, what sells more than sex? And not just sex, but also the sexual objectification of women. And so it wasn't too long after rap started to take off in the mainstream and was getting more fans who were outside of the black community that the most popular messaging became that which was issuing from groups like NWA, which was saying, our life is tough, but we don't love these H words. I mean, we just saw Snoop Dogg at the Olympics, right? And Snoop Dogg was not part of NWA, although he was affiliated with Dr. Dre, obviously. But he is one of the most famous rappers in the world. And what's his tagline? We don't love you H words. So this is what allowed hip-hop to explode on the mainstream stage. And unfortunately, it had dramatic negative effects for black women.
By the way, speaking of Snoop Dogg, I mean, after reading your book and then seeing him on the Olympic stage, as it were, in terms of television and so on, I got a much different reaction. What was your reaction to seeing him there? He was everywhere.
He was everywhere. I mean, the funny thing about Snoop is that he's an entertainer, right? And he's remade himself many times. He was, a gun-toting shooter and a thug, and then he was a pornographer, an actual pornographer, while he was a rapper. And now he's just, an American icon. And so you see him dressed in the full regalia for dressage and actually looking the part. I mean, it's hilarious. So there's a way in which he's simply an entertainer. But I often think about the relationship between someone like Snoop Dogg and someone like Thomas Jefferson. There are so many white people, especially white conservatives, who are like, we must respect the founding of America and Thomas Jefferson. And then there will be plenty of progressives who will say he owned slaves. What do we do with a character like Snoop Dogg? Here is a man who created some of the most popular and also hateful, misogynistic music in the world. And he is a huge celebrity unto this day, and we enjoy him as a personality. But we also have to reckon with his legacy of someone who gained popularity largely through the degradation of black women.
I also have to ask you about Kamala Harris and her run. Obviously, she would become the first black woman to become president of the United States. Seems to be fairly well accepted, at least popular for the moment. What do you make of her and her appearance? As it were, I mean, she has straight hair, her skin color is a bit lighter. I mean, what does that say about the electorate, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's not as if people are and have always been extraordinarily enthusiastic about Kamala Harris. And
right,
so,
it's true.
Yeah. So even though she's biracial and she wears her hair straightened, and, I don't want for people to feel like they don't have the right to wear their hair however they want, right? So it's important to acknowledge personal liberty. But, the situation is that it's a little bit more complex when we're talking about someone like her, because her record is quite spotted as it pertains to supporting various, let's say, black men in the criminal justice system, et cetera. So when thinking about someone like Kamala Harris, I don't know if she fits so fully within this conversation for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is that she is wealthy and used to sort of prosecute a number of black folks for various crimes. But I will say that it's been so exciting to see her select Tim Walz and have him come out and be this sort of like powerful orator, because it speaks to the possibility that many of the concerns that a lot of black people, black women, BIPOC people in general have had might actually be addressed by this administration. And I just want to say one other thing, which is that when the Obamas were in office, there was so much hatred of Michelle Obama, at least on the part of conservatives. But now, look at how much love we see expressed for Michelle Obama, a dark-skinned black woman, right, after all of the ways in which they were trying to undermine her based on her appearance. So there is the possibility that we are starting to see a shift in America where people are rethinking their old misogynoir positions.
So finally, I want to get to back to one of the major themes, which is romance dead? I mean, is it something that's not viable anymore? I mean, what do you make of it? Because I think you mentioned in your book that there's a large number of women who are still single, maybe even the majority, and that obviously that was not true before. High divorce rates, for example. What's going on here in your view?
We are currently in the middle of a gender and sexual revolution, but people aren't calling it that for some reason. And that's the major reason why romance is dissolving. I mean, and this revolution has been coming ever since the feminist movement of the early 20th century. Women were saying, we want equality. And then as a backlash that many women didn't see because it largely took place in men's magazines, men were saying, we don't want these women demanding equality, right? So that kind of tussle that began in the early 20th century, right as dating was taking off, mind you, right? So the guardrails were gone. There were no more chaperones. People could choose their own partners. That's a failure. That's proven to be a failure because people don't know how to appropriately choose a partner for a lifetime. They're often choosing based on superficial things. So for over a century now, we've been seeing this pushback to romance. And I think we're actually seeing its end because we no longer want to occupy these gendered roles. Romance suggests that women have to be docile and accommodating and attractive and elite. I don't know too many women these days who are hoping to be this unless they actually identify as trad wives. I don't know how many men want to be self-sacrificing, be the sole provider, be entirely responsible for the financial well-being of their families. I don't even know how much this is possible in America today. So the gender roles that are demanded by romance really don't exist anymore, except by those people who are performing them largely for their social media audience.
We've been speaking with Dr. Sabrina Strings. She is a professor and North Hall Chair of Black Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Written a new book entitled The End of Love, Racism, Sexism, and the Death of Romance. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.